It is undeniably one of the most debated, influential, and just downright ancient texts in all of human history. Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're setting out on a seriously fascinating journey to unpack the foundational narratives of the Old Testament. We are going to be surveying the sweeping epic that stretches from Genesis all the way through Deuteronomy. Now, whether you grew up hearing these ancient stories or you're coming to them for the very first time today, we're going to look at this source material objectively. We'll be exploring the rich, complex tapestry of history, culture, and theology it presents. All right, let's dive right in.
95%. I mean, that is just a staggering number, right? The source material highlights that parts of this text have been translated into over 1,800 languages. That makes it accessible to at least 95% of the world's entire population. So regardless of your personal background or beliefs, its undeniable global impact makes it an absolutely essential piece of world literature and ancient history. I mean, it literally shaped the laws, the literature, and the culture that you and I probably interact with every single day.
So, to make these thousands of years of dense history a bit more manageable, we've structured our explainer into 5 distinct chronological eras: the importance of the Old Testament, the primeval era, the patriarchs, becoming a nation, and finally, the journey to Canaan.
Okay, let's kick things off with Section 1, the importance of the Old Testament and setting the historical stage.
Our source argues that you really cannot fully grasp the complexities of world religions, literature, or even the New Testament without understanding the deep historical and cultural bedrock laid down in these early books. You know, it's a super common misconception to draw this sharp dichotomy, viewing the Old Testament strictly as this harsh era of wrath and rigid law, while seeing the New Testament as the era of love and grace. But the source text actually pushes back hard against this binary. It points out that key Old Testament figures, like Moses and the prophet Jeremiah, they explicitly describe the divine as a being of immense love, mercy, and justice. The text presents grace as something highly active throughout the entire scope of this ancient history, not just something that showed up later.
Moving right along to Section 2, the primeval era, which covers Genesis chapters 1 through 11.
Here, we are zooming way out to a macro-level history. We're talking about a massive span of time, stretching all the way from the proposed origin of the universe right up to the birth of a man named Abraham. Tracking this grand sweep of primeval history, the text outlines 4 foundational milestones for all of humanity. It kicks off with the creation, setting the literal stage of the cosmos. That is quickly followed by the fall, where human disobedience leads to an expulsion from the ideal state of Eden. Then we hit the flood, which is presented as an act of profound divine judgment on a corrupt world, ultimately leading to a fresh start with Noah. And finally, we see the Tower of Babel, which the text uses to explain the dispersion of humanity across the globe and the creation of different languages.
Now, the source presents 2 very early, very contrasting lineages that beautifully illustrate one of the text's absolute core themes. First, you have the lineage of Cain, which is described as highly natural and worldly. These are the folks building the first cities, inventing metallurgy, but sadly also perpetuating a brutal cycle of vengeance. In stark contrast to that, the lineage of Seth is presented as fundamentally spiritual. This line is characterized by individuals like Enoch, who are specifically described as walking closely with God. It's a really fascinating look at the natural human condition weighed directly against the spiritual pursuit of God.
That brings us to Section 3, the patriarchs. Here we'll look at the covenant and the family.
So, the narrative focus makes a dramatic shift here. We go from the macro history of the entire world, zooming all the way down to the micro history of a single nomadic family living in the ancient Near East. Between roughly 2000 and 1600 BC, we see this generational relay race of a divine covenant. The baton of this promise is passed from Abraham down to his son Isaac, then to Jacob, and finally on to Joseph. Each generation faces intense trials, massive cultural challenges, and, to be honest, some pretty glaring personal flaws. Yet, the text shows this overarching promise enduring through it all.
So, what exactly was this big promise? Well, the source details a profound, multi-part covenant made with Abraham. First, he's promised that he will become a great nation, that he'll be blessed, and that his name will be made great. But it goes even further than that, and this is where it gets truly monumental. Divine protection is promised, and ultimately, a staggering guarantee is made that all the tribes of the earth will be blessed through his specific lineage. The source positions this generation-spanning covenant as the definitive catalyst for basically the rest of biblical history.
Let's see how this builds with Abraham's grandson, Jacob. The text highlights a deeply physical, incredibly human moment where Jacob literally wrestles through the night with a divine being at the Jabbok River. Because of this wild encounter, his name is changed to Israel, which translates directly to "he who struggles with God."
This is a crucial detail to hang on to, because this single man's new name literally defines the entire geopolitical nation that follows him to this very day.
The patriarchal era concludes with the incredibly dramatic life of Joseph. Talk about a roller coaster. Joseph's trajectory is a wild four-step journey. He starts out as the highly favored son back in Canaan, gets betrayed and sold into slavery by his very own jealous brothers, ends up wrongly imprisoned down in Egypt, but then eventually rises all the way to the rank of prime minister. The text uses Joseph's unbelievable journey as the vital mechanism to move the early Israelites out of Canaan and safely down into the land of Egypt, which perfectly sets the stage for our next epic.
Which leads us right into Section 4, Becoming a Nation, covering the books of Exodus and Leviticus.
We transition here into the absolute crucible of Egyptian slavery. Over a few centuries, that small nomadic family of just 70 people exploded into a massive population, so massive, in fact, that a new pharaoh viewed them as a serious national security threat. So this era begins under the heavy, brutal oppression of Egyptian slavery, around 1600 BC. But then, a leader named Moses emerges to challenge Pharaoh. This standoff leads to the famous Exodus around 1440 BC, where the Israelites finally escape 400 years of bondage, eventually setting up a pivotal camp at Mount Sinai just a year later.
According to the source, this escape wasn't just some clever political negotiation. It was entirely supernatural. The text neutrally reports on a series of 10 devastating plagues brought down upon Egypt, culminating in the Passover. This event, where blood painted on the doorposts spared the Israelites from the ultimate plague of the firstborn, is established by the source as the definitive defining act of liberation. It's the moment that forged their national identity forever.
Okay, so you're finally a free people at Mount Sinai. Now what? Well, they desperately needed laws and structure. The book of Leviticus outlines highly complex religious codes. Honestly, think of it sort of like an ancient spiritual tax code. To break it down simply, there were 4 primary sacrifices instituted at Sinai. We've got the burnt offering for consecration, the peace offering for fellowship with the divine, the sin offering for unintentional wrongs, and the trespass offering, which required actual restitution. The text explains that these highly structured, heavily symbolic rituals functioned deliberately to set the Israelites completely apart from the often brutal religious practices of the surrounding Canaanites.
And that brings us to our final leg, Section 5, Journey to Canaan, looking at the books of Numbers and Deuteronomy.
Now, you would think being free and having a brand new set of laws would make things pretty easy, right? Well, not exactly. The text illustrates a highly tense, rebellious, and frankly arduous journey as this newly formed nation heads toward the Promised Land. Their departure from Sinai was quickly followed by a massive crisis at a place called Kadesh. And because of this, what honestly should have been a journey of mere weeks turned into 38 agonizing years of wilderness wandering. It's kind of the ultimate historical example of refusing to stop and ask for directions. Finally, a completely new generation arrives at the plains of Moab, sitting right on the literal edge of Canaan.
So, what actually happened at Kadesh to cause a nearly 4-decade delay? The text explains it was a pivotal, catastrophic crisis of faith. 12 spies were sent into Canaan to scope it out. 10 of those spies returned absolutely terrified, reporting giants in the land and urging the people to literally retreat back to slavery in Egypt out of sheer fear. But 2 spies, Joshua and Caleb, urged faith, insisting they could conquer the land. The source notes that the broader population's massive loss of faith resulted in a divine sentence. They would wander that desert until the entire fearful, older generation had died out.
Fast forward nearly 40 years and we arrive at the book of Deuteronomy. Moses is now at the very end of his life on the plains of Moab, looking over at the Promised Land, a land he is not allowed to enter himself. Imagine the urgency here. The source summarizes his final speeches. He reviews their historical failures so they won't repeat them. He repeats the 10 Commandments. He establishes brand new civil laws for their future settled life in Canaan, and he formally transfers all power over to his successor, Joshua.
And that leaves us right on the cliffhanger edge of our explainer. The Old Testament narrative pauses right here on the plains of Moab, staring across the river into Canaan. It leaves us with this profound historical tension. Will this young, untested new generation actually conquer the Promised Land with faith, or will they just repeat the exact same rebellions and failures of their fathers? It's a seriously compelling question that perfectly sets the stage for the historical books that follow. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through the text today. I really hope unpacking this massive sweep of history gave you some great new insights. Keep exploring, and I'll catch you next time.